If you were looking for a white girl singer that might be able to carry off an album made in the nerve center of the American rhythm and blues scene, with the absolute cream of the producers, arrangers and session musicians of the late 1960s, you wouldn't necessarily choose someone who cut her teeth sounding as folky as this. And you might not even select someone sounding as poppy as this. But when the singer on both of those went to Tennessee in 1968, the result was recording gold, even if no one seemed to think so at the time. Tonight, we tell the tale of how a classic album was born. I'm Paul Sexton. Welcome to Dusty in Memphis.
They turned it into a diamond. It was just an awestruck moment. It was just tasty as could be.
It was the only album in her entire career I've heard her talk about every track with pride.
The fact that this record has had such a fantastic afterlife, it's been one of the joys of my life.
Baby, I know you've got to go. I have no right to tell you not to go. The road just isn't there for us. There never was a prayer for us. You know how much I want you now. I don't wanna stay here, give you fear to haunt you now. But for now, baby, to set you free to choose again. It's your life to win or lose again. But hey, don't forget about me now, baby. Please, don't forget about me now, baby. Can I borrow a minute of your tomorrow? Don't let it cause sorrow. Please, just don't forget about me now, baby. Don't forget about me.
Dusty Springfield was the former convent girl from Hampstead in North London who could just about sing the phone book. Not to mention a songbook that stretched from the sometimes hokey folk of the Springfields in the early 60s to her establishment by the middle of the decade as Britain's reigning pop queen. But what we're celebrating tonight is Dusty's landmark session, and a very eventful session it was too, in the heartland of American soul music at American Studios in Memphis. That's where she made an album that would be largely overlooked at the time, but now is rightly seen as one of the greatest white soul albums ever made. Every track on Dusty in Memphis is an absolute gem. And as the story unfolds, I'll talk to the people who helped create it, including several of the crack team of session musicians and its legendary co-producer, Jerry Wexler. Plus her longtime friend and sometime manager, Vicky Wickham, and another good friend, Gary Moore, who's remastered the album for reissue on several occasions. He'll demonstrate exactly how Dusty sounded in the studio. And on top of all that, as an extra treat, we have excerpts from a 1980s interview with Dusty, never before broadcast on British radio. Dusty was 24 when I Only Want to Be With You became her first solo UK hit in 1963, and she was a devoted fan of American black music, as Vicky Wickham remembers.
From the early records, she was always covering blues singer, R&B singers records. I mean, from Mitty Collier to Baby Washington to Fontella Bass to Shirley Caesar. I mean, on and on. It was always the black singers that she absolutely loved and emulated to a degree. And certainly the sound of blackness is what people hear in her voice and think is soulful. And indeed it is.
I had a talk with my man last night. He reassured me everything was still alright. As the night grew light, my blues got right. He made
From the 1965 album Everything's Coming Up Dusty, her version of I Had a Talk with My Man, a soul hit the year before for one of those heroines that Vicky mentioned, Birmingham, Alabama-born singer Mitty Collier. Dusty Springfield's biggest loves were the music and the artists of Tamla Motown and Atlantic Records. As she became more famous, she met them, became their friend, and won their respect with her soulful voice. But she was never entirely comfortable. Here is Dusty Springfield.
Well, actually, it was very intimidating, because what was viewed as soulful here is not necessarily viewed as soulful there by the real soul people. I think it was rather sad in that, you know, we used to couple their material. I remember having a very unpleasant time with Nina Simone once, because I can't remember, it was something I did that she had done, and she was very resentful about it. But most of the time I was kind of adopted, certainly by Motown. And I used to hang out with everybody, really. It was great. They weren't Motown people, but, I mean, the sort of the Wilson Pickett's of the world, and people who had not that many records, like Sugar Pie DeSanto, and a great soulful dress. I mean, I used to hang out at the Apollo all the time. It was great. I mean, I was just so much protected and with such affection for me, except for a couple of run-ins with people who were resentful. But basically, I was treated really well, and I had the best time of my life.
One of Dusty's many Motown moments in her early solo career, covering the Supremes. But while she was meeting her black music favourites, I think it's fair to say her covers of their songs were often a bit too polite, dare I say, a bit too white. At this time, she was really a singer of pop songs with soul seasoning. At its best, and as her career developed through the mid-60s, that could be a dynamite combination.
I think I'm going back to the things I learned so in my youth. I think I'm returning to those days when I was young enough to know the truth. Now there are no games to only pass the time. No more no Christmas bells to chime, but thinking young and growing older is no sin, and I can play the game of life to win.
Meanwhile, in America, a record company formed just after World War II was reaching critical mass as one of the homes of R&B and jazz music. Atlantic Records had long boasted a fantastic roster of artists, superb songwriting and A&R, and an unbeatable team of record producers, including the man who'd invented the very term rhythm and blues. Producer of such monumental artists as Ray Charles, Ruth Brown, Wilson Pickett and Aretha Franklin, he was and is the mighty Jerry Wexler, now 89 years old. And back in the 60s, he'd noticed Dusty all right.
I was an admirer of Dusty. Anybody with ears had to be, you know, all the good records she made in England and the good stuff she did in America with people like Burt Bacharach, the best producers and arrangers. Of course, her records were always on the radio, and one could virtually track her career by listening to all her records.
Dusty had long told Vicky Wickham of her dream to make a definitive and authentic soul album, but with her trademark lack of self-belief, she didn't really think it would happen.
She thought the record company, etc., would never let her, and that's why when she got the BBC series and they allowed her to do all types of music, she could do her Brazilian music, her Irish folk music. I mean, it gave her the breadth, because she always loved all types of music. It was a dream rather than a reality. And of course, only when she was signed to Atlantic the team came on board, and it was Jerry Wexler, obviously, who suggested this was the record to do and where to do it. It then had a handle to it. She was in awe, she was terrified, because, suddenly she was able to do what she'd wanted to for all these years, and Dusty being Dusty, wanted it to be the best it possibly could, and, was terrified it wouldn't be.
After the immense international success of You Don't Have to Say You Love Me in 1966, 67 was a little on the lean side. There were no top 10 singles or albums at all for Dusty in the UK that year. And maybe it was that obvious need for a new direction, coupled with her fan worship of Jerry's work, that eventually gave her the courage to go for it.
I'm going back.
At some point, it was Dusty to make the move. She decided she wanted to come to America and record for Atlantic Records, specifically with my production. And so the contract had what they call a key man clause. In other words, if I were the key man and somehow not available to produce the record, then the contract would be voided. So she must have had some notion about tracking the records I did with people like Aretha Franklin, Wilson Pickett, The Drifter, and so on. And she wanted that sound.
I love you.
Dusty did not present herself as a songwriter at all. So it behooved us to find the songs for her. And I had assistants who helped me, scouring the boondocks for proper material, the B-side of an old Motown record, or some old R&B classic. So at our first meeting, which was at my house in Long Island, I thought that would be a more amiable venue, a more suitable venue than the office, the phones ringing and all the frantic stuff that goes on in record offices. And so I prepared a plethora of material, of demos to show her. And that was before cassettes, so these were acetates. I don't know, there must have been more than 50 or 60, I have no idea. Anyhow, I played them for one after another, and one after another she turned them all down. I had a band waiting, the Muscle Shoals band was waiting. They were reserved to do the session with Dusty. We had to cancel because she rejected all the songs. I went back to England. It was a real downer for me.
Gut reaction was always really good about music, about choice of material. She really wouldn't sing something she didn't think was right, in either lyrically or in terms of the range of her voice, because the range of her voice, it's silly to say she didn't have a great range, because of course she did. If you listen to You Don't Have to Say You Love Me, I mean, that range is extraordinary. But basically, she liked and preferred her voice in a lower range, so she would choose songs that fitted it. And it was a sound rather than a vocal in a way. I mean, somebody that I consider a real vocalist is Barbra Streisand, and Dusty is, to me, a much better sound.
Anyhow, we agreed that she would come back after a while. I don't know what the interim period, how long that was. And again came to my house, but this time I had reduced the number of demos or records or whatever that I had to show her, maybe on vinyl or plastic, to about 20. She loved 15 of them immoderately, the same songs that she had rejected. So now we had a group of material, and I must say that the songs that we ultimately recorded with her were maybe the best agglomeration of material that I'd ever put together. The songs, I now have to say immodestly, were exceptional, every one of them.
The second time around, I think what Jerry had learnt too was to tell her who wrote them. And of course there were Goffin and King songs, and Carol and Jerry were always her favourite writers. She kept their acetates that were sent her from Screen Gems under the bed. She knew who Randy Newman was. You know, suddenly too they took on relevance because she knew who'd written them. And also I think she gave herself more time to really listen to them, try them out. And I think the first time round, she was just, I mean, to be sitting in a room with Jerry Wexler to her was like, my God, I'm sitting with God, you know.
Just a little loving early in the morning beats a cup of coffee for starting off the day. Just a little loving when the world is yawning makes you wake up feeling good things are coming your way. This whole world wouldn't be half as bad, it wouldn't be half as sad if each and everybody in it had just a little loving early in the morning, that little extra something to kind of see them through. Nothing turns the day on, really gets it done, like a little bit of loving from some loving someone like you.
Co-produced by Atlantic's Holy Trinity of Jerry Wexler, Tom Dowd and Arif Mardin, the opening track on Dusty in Memphis, and my personal favourite, I must say, Just a Little Lovin', written by Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil. Now, before we track down a bunch of the guys who actually played on the record and eavesdrop on the making of this timeless album, let's get an insight on what Dusty really sounded like on a studio date. Longtime Universal Music engineer Gary Moore has remastered the Dusty in Memphis album for reissue on a number of occasions and was both a great admirer and personal friend of Dusty's.
Let's be honest about this, as he's the best singer Britain has produced. I can't think of any other, you know. There just isn't. Off the range, Dusty could do everything from country and western to soul to big band ballads. She could do the lot with ease.
You've come up very kindly with a unique way of demonstrating that. We have bad news and good news, don't we? The bad news is that the masters of the Dusty in Memphis album are not to be found. That's right, isn't it?
The original masters, yeah, because it was recorded. It was a joint venture at the time with Atlantic Records in America and Philips Records in the UK. The original were done, as all masters were at that time, but four track. That means that the vocals would be recorded on one track and the backing on the other three, like solo backing singers and brass and strings, and then remixed. So it would have been really nice, since we hold all of Dusty's masters at Universal, to have been able to say, right, here's the original multi-track of the Dusty in Memphis album. But unfortunately, and the record company, nobody can find out what has happened to these precious multi-tracks. So we can't actually play you anything from that. But what we have got here is, when I was doing a greatest hits type album, and the record company asked me if I could remix a lot of the mono singles into stereo. Some of them were successful, some of them weren't, because Dusty had tracked the mix down. But there's one here we can use. It's a track called Give Me Time, because people kept asking me what it was like to, or what you did, what was involved with remixing. So I made this sort of tape up purely for my own enjoyment, and hopefully it'll give the listeners some idea of what Dusty was like in the studio, because you can actually hear her singing, shall we say, naked, without any backing, without any reverb on the voice, and you can hear quite clearly what a very strong and powerful singer Dusty was. First, I will play you a bit of the shall we say, the composite track that's with Dusty, with the orchestra, and this is the opening of Give Me Time.
If you'll only give me time.
So the next bit we'll hear is Dusty. What I've done is you'll hear parts of the orchestra coming in and out, like the brass section, the woodwind section, and then you'll hear Dusty. We will now hear Dusty. I'll remove the orchestra bit, the backing, and you'll hear Dusty singing in the studio with reverberation on her voice, slight reverberation on her voice.
That's when I reach out for your hand. So darling, give me time.
And now here's just a wee tiny bit here of Dusty with the reverberation removed, and so you can hear Dusty's voice as it is in a very dry studio, which is, believe you me, is a very, very difficult place to sing because there's just nothing to reflect your voice back. So here's Dusty without reverberation in her voice in the studio.
Yours for as long as I live. If you'll only give me time, baby.
Now let's do what Dusty Springfield did 38 years ago and head for Memphis and Chips Moman's American Studios, one of the two southern locations that Atlantic had been using, Muscle Shoals in Alabama being the other, as the delivery room for some of the most exciting music of the 1960s.
Instead of going to Muscle Shoals, we went to a studio in Memphis owned by Chips Moman, a terrific arranger, guitar player, entrepreneur, all-around hustler, a great record man, to his studio, the American studio in Memphis, because at that time Muscle Shoals was busy. I couldn't engage them. Maybe it was the best turn down I ever had, because going to Memphis provided us with the album Dusty in Memphis.
Mike Leach and Bobby Emmons were members of the team of musicians later to become known as the Memphis Boys, who played on sessions at American Studios. We'll hear from Bobby in a moment. Mike never questioned the idea of a British singer, or anyone else for that matter, coming down to get some of that southern fried soul.
To me, it was exciting to have the big guys come down, you know, and choose us to do their records and things. But, you know, they were going down to Muscle Shoals. They were recording in the South. That was their thing, because they were getting some very good product out of the southern musicians, and like Aretha and Dusty coming down to get this southern feel or soul or whatever you want to call it.
I guess the new studio was kind of getting, maybe Jerry or Tom or some of the guys at Atlantic might have been wanting to try out the band, whether or not it was. I think one of them made the remark during the sessions that a studio is just bricks and boards. You know, we make records with people.
American Studios engineer Ed Collis.
Wexler was a real prospector. He came down and saw what was going on and grabbed it. And, you know, they used Muscle Shoals. That was a real neat time to be there. I mean, it was like a whole century of stuff happening in a couple of years. It was a hot thing. Memphis was, a good funky focal point. Soul, I think, is not a colored thing.
Can I cry a little bit? There's nobody to notice it. Can I cry if I want to? No one cares. Why can't I pretend that you love me again? All I had has been taken from me. Now I'm crying tears that never come me. Just one smile, pain's forgiven. Just one kiss, the hurt's all gone. Just one smile will make my life worth living. A little dream to fill my world upon. How I wish I could say all the things I want to say. If some way you could see what's in my heart. Oh, baby, I don't ask for much. A look, a smile, a touch.
penned by a still pretty unknown writer called Randy Newman. Just One Smile, one of his 2 early numbers selected for Dusty in Memphis, the other being I Don't Want to Hear It Anymore. Meanwhile, Vicky Wickham was back at home minding the store. Or minding the dog, anyway.
At that stage, I actually was sharing a flat with her because I didn't have a flat. I'd left one, I'd gone to another, and I was staying with her on Baker Street, and I was dog sitting. She had this horrendous little poodle thing called Tamla Motown. Not my favourite dog in the entire world. But Vic Billings and I took turns in dog sitting, and she went off to New York and then Memphis, and she would call almost every day, you know, either playing bits of tracks or saying what had happened, who she'd met, who she was talking to.
Now here's our first sign of the uneasy juxtaposition of instinctive American soulfulness and traditional British reserve.
She'd been managed through the 60s by Vic Billings, and Vic did a wonderful job of keeping her on course, you know, in terms of making the right decisions with her about what her career was. But I think he also was involved to a certain degree in affirming the songs she chose for the albums. Not that he chose them, he didn't, she did. But, you know, there was somebody to say, yes, you're right, maybe rethink that one. And of course, then he wasn't involved. And I think not having Vic as a sounding board, as somebody to support, I mean, she went on her own. And she didn't take Pat Rhodes with her, you know, who'd been her secretary through the Springfields and was working with her as a PA secretary to the end. She suddenly had dropped her team, and I think that made her more vulnerable too, and made her obviously nervous.
Let's say it's day one in the studio at American. The band are ready to go, right? I mean, they're all in position. Is Tom Dowd there and Reef at that point?
Tom Dowd and Reef were there, yes, very much so. The way we used to work it, we would have the arranger make the charts on all the songs, but they were very simple, almost simplistic, because instead of regulation chord symbols, they went by numbers. 1 to 7. My practice was to start the session at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the musicians were ready with all of the songs on their music stands with very simple chord sequences. That's all there were. There were not arrangements. They were just chord sequences. And this was the Southern way of recording that I had learned in Memphis and Muscle Shoals. To build the song organically, what you did, you had the musicians start to play these chords, and just playing the chords, a guitarist or a keyboard man would come up with a lick or an idea, and after a while, and it never took too long, a rhythm pattern would be established, and that would be really the basis of the song. And when the rhythm track was almost finished, in the penultimate moment, that's where I would have the singer come in and start to sing, so that he or she could interface with the musicians at that point, and they could modify what they were doing to particularly suit and accommodate the singer's phrasing. Only one problem: Dusty wouldn't sing. So we had to imagine it.
She didn't sing a single note in Memphis. She didn't feel bad about it. She just was overwhelmed by the fact that, you know, she was in a studio where all these wonderful legends that she absolutely loved and looked up to had been. And I think it was absolute insecurity, you know, being there with Tom Dowd, Reef Martin, the musicians, Jerry. I mean, she couldn't deal with it. She just went into a little shell, and, you know, only when she got to New York could she open up and sing. Dusty would really get herself into a state, as my mother would say, and when she was in a state, she couldn't function. I mean, she really couldn't sing. She would croak. She really made herself almost physically sick out of, you know, terror. And there was nothing she could do about it. She had to, you know, go through it and then come out the other end. And that haunted her a lot of her life. I mean, even in later days when we were doing Dusty, the Columbia record, and she was in Nashville, the same thing at the beginning, you know, because she, again, idolized a lot of the country musicians who'd been there. And, you know, had to take a break and let her do it, you know, again in her own time.
And that's why Dusty in Memphis should, strictly speaking, be called Dusty in New York, where she would later cut her vocals for the record with Messrs. Wexler, Dowd and Mardine. Dusty in Memphis session men, pianist Bobby Wood and first drummer Gene Chrisman.
I'd heard after the fact that I don't know if she was real comfortable being there with us at the time, or if I had also heard that she really liked the whole band with the strings and the whole thing written out and orchestra and never do it all at one time. But this is just what I've heard since, all of this was over and it's been done. And then probably I've only heard this about 3 or 4 years ago that this happened, that she really, I don't think was really comfortable coming to Memphis. I don't know.
I don't remember her. I didn't know if she didn't know the material or what was happening, but she wasn't singing out very much, and we were kind of used to the Wilson Pickett's and Aretha Franklin's and people like that were wall-to-wall vocal, and it was just like everything that she was doing I thought was real timid, and I found out in recent months when I talked to Jerry Wexler, that she was kind of intimidated with the studio and I guess, I don't know, being in the South or whatever it was. And we didn't work the way that she was used to working. We worked mainly with just a small rhythm section, and then they overdubbed everything, So I think she was just totally blown away by being in such a different environment.
She loved to have people around her that she could trust, that certainly she could relax with. And I think to relax was probably a very difficult thing for Dusty, to actually unwind, because people are always asking her to do this and open that and be on this show and do that show. And she wanted to get on with her own type of music, which was really soul music, I suppose. And to get on with that sort of stuff, she wanted the people that she could have the confidence to go and do it with.
And with Dusty clearly not at home with the American style of recording, tensions came to the boil. I asked Jerry Wexler about an infamous story from the sessions.
It did happen. We're in the control room, and she lost her temper and actually flung an ashtray in my direction. I ducked it. I was a little more agile back in those days. She got mad at Tommy Dowd and called him a prima donna. There was nobody less prima donna in my whole experience than Tom Dowd. He was so biddable and easy to work with. And this time, I got my Jewish up, and I said, Dusty, there's only one prima donna here, and I'm looking at her. But these were transient events. There was no bad mood, no negative ambience. It was just little passing things.
The commercial failure of the Dusty in Memphis album was all the more disappointing and surprising because the lead single from it, released late in 1968, was a transatlantic top 10 hit. I heard this riff on a ringtone the other day. It is timeless.
All great tunes by great songwriters, except one surprise called Son of a Preacher Man, written by a couple of Southern irregulars. But that fitted in seamlessly.
Billy Ray was a preacher's son, and when his daddy would visit, he'd come along. When they gathered around and started talking, Cousin Billy would take me walking. Out through the backyard we go walking. Then he looked into my eyes. Lord knows to my surprise, the only one who could ever reach me was the son of a preacher man. The only boy who could ever teach me was the son of a preacher man. Yes, he was. He was. Yes, he was. Being good isn't always easy, no matter how hard I try. When he started sweet talking to me, he'd come and tell me everything is alright. He'd kiss and tell me everything's alright. Can I get away again tonight? The only one who could ever reach me was the son of a preacher man. The only boy who could ever teach me was the son of a preacher man. Yes, he was. He was. Lord knows he was. Yes, he was.
It was almost written for Aretha, but she turned it down, just the way she turned down Let It Be. Same thing with Son of a Preacher Man, which was written for her. She turned it down, and then after Dusty had a hit, she then liked it, and of course it became an album cut. What I enjoyed was Dusty on that TV show, South Bank, coming on and singing the song the way Aretha would have sung it.
Dusty herself was certainly a huge fan of the songwriters whose work inhabited the Memphis album, many of whom were graduates of the Brill Building in New York, like Bacharach and David.
Prince's, yeah, I mean, those people. I couldn't sing everything Bacharach wrote because he wrote truly difficult things, and the perfect voice for that was Dion, because of that gossamer quality. And I didn't have the lightness. It was almost, she was touching the notes, whereas I have a much heavier voice, and it was actually much more difficult for me to sing them. But they had such meat in them, and they were so difficult. They were such great songs.
The appreciation was mutual, and it goes on. Here's Burt Bacharach and first Hal David.
Everybody in England in particular, but around the whole world, no matter how they speak in their native tongue, England, it's the same. We speak the same language, not necessarily the same way. But when they sing like Americans. I think she was accepted rapidly.
It's a great album, by the way. I turned my son onto it. It gets downloaded. Listen to Dusty.
In the land of make-believe, you're mine tonight. Although you were far away in the land of make-believe, I'm holding you tight. The silver moon is shining above, and there's love in your eyes, and I'm kissing you like I used to do yesterday in paradise. I've been living in the land of make-believe since you've been gone. I need you so much that without your love I must deceive myself to go on. Your little hand caresses my face. We embrace tenderly. Never will we part deep down in my heart. You are always here with me. You are always here with me. In the land of make-believe. Your loving hand caresses my face. We embrace tenderly. Never will we part deep down in my heart. You are always here with me. You are always here with me.
Session player Mike Leach.
Only comment I got to make is I listened to the Dusty album a while ago. What a marvelous voice she had. I mean, just fantastic. Really, really nice. She could get more out of singing softly and get more out of an inflection in her voice than any singer I've ever heard.
The soft voice, that's the hardest, but they're always the ones that people want. And I stand there like going blue in the face. There's never any time to breathe. I'm holding onto the mic with both hands, just trying to stay upright. And those songs are the voice records of all time.
Dusty in Memphis featured Bacharach and David's In the Land of Make-Believe and no fewer than 4 songs by Goffin and King.
I worship Carole King. Most everything she writes, I want to sing. We met in the Brill Building in New York when she was really just a teenager. She just sat and played the piano, and it was just wild about what she wrote.
Your toy balloon has sailed in the sky. But now it must fall to the ground. Now your sad eyes reveal just how badly you feel. 'Cause there is no easy way down. The view from the cliffs must have been exciting. And up to the peaks you were like to climb to the heights of love, where our fantasy world can be found. But you must know in the end, when it's time to descend, that there is no easy way down. You know you're gonna find there is no easy way down.
Jerry Goffin and Carole King's No Easy Way Down, put forward by Jerry Wexler for Dusty in Memphis, along with a song featuring an unusually risque narrative.
One of the songs came from two of my very good friends at Muscle Shoals, written by Donnie Fritz and Eddie Hinton, Breakfast in Bed. It's a wonderful character song. The older woman, maybe hot to trot, inviting a younger man to do the beast with two backs, you know. At least I think that's the impression of the song. And I think this song could be recorded again very successfully for a big hit.
You've been crying, your face is a mess. Come in, baby, you can dry the tears on my dress. She's hurt you again, I can tell. Oh, I know they look so well. Don't be shy, you've been here before. Pull your shoes right down, and I will lock the door, and no one has to know you've come here again. Darling, it will be like it's always been before. Come on over here, breakfast bed and kiss and breathe. You don't have to say you love me. Breakfast bed, nothing need to say. Ain't no need. What's your hurry? Please don't eat and run. You can let her wait, my darling. It's been so long since I've had you here. You come again, darling. It will be like it's always been before. Hey, Charlie. Breakfast bed and kiss and breathe. You don't have to say you love me. Breakfast bed, nothing need to say. Breakfast bed and kiss and breathe. You don't have to say you love me. Breakfast bed.
And Jerry Wexler, good old record man that he was, used some old-fashioned chutzpah to promote another song from Dusty in Memphis.
I took a shot with Windmills because of the timing. It was up for an Academy Award. So I did something desperate. I prepared a couple of thousand singles, promotional singles, and I had them wrapped and packaged, and on the envelope I said, open immediately, Academy Song winner. And I had one of my guys waiting at the warehouse or wherever it was, or the studio, to take these records to the post office. And it was a standby thing because we watched it on the television, of course, and it won. It was the winner, the best motion picture song of the year. And so he immediately took off for the post office. And the next morning or so, all the disc jockeys around the country got this package that opened immediately. Academy winner. Maybe it was a good move, you know, in theory, but it didn't make it a hit.
Round like a circle in a spiral, like a wheel within a wheel, never ending or beginning on an ever spinning reel, like a snowball down a mountain or a carnival balloon, like a carousel that's turning, running rings around the moon, like a clock whose hands are sweeping past the minutes of its space, and the world is like an apple whirling silently in space, like the circles that you find in the windmills of your mind. Like a tunnel that you follow to a tunnel of its own, down a hollow to a cavern where the sun has never shone, like a door that keeps revolving in a half-forgotten dream, or the ripples from a pebble someone tosses in a stream, like a clock whose hands are sweeping past the minutes of its face, and the world is like an apple whirling silently in space, like the circles that you find in the windmills of your mind. Keys that jingle in your pocket, words that jangle in your head. Why did summer go so quickly? Was it something that you said? Lovers walk along the shore and leave their footprints in the sand. Is the sound of distant drumming just the fingers of your hand? Pictures hanging in a hallway and the fragment of a song. Had remembered names and faces, but to whom do they belong? When you knew that it was over, you were suddenly aware that the autumn leaves were turning to the color of his hair, like a circle in a spiral, like a wheel within a wheel, never ending or beginning on an ever spinning reel, as the images unwind, like the circles that you find in the windows of your
Released as a single from Dusty in Memphis, but an Academy Award winner for its writers Michel Legrand and Marilyn and Alan Bergman. That's Windmills of Your Mind. So it was hardly ideal for the producers to have to reconvene with Dusty in New York to cut her vocals, but with their collective brilliance, Wexler, Dowd, Mardin and Springfield turned a necessity into a virtue.
It was very frustrating, and I thought it would impact negatively. However, just dumb luck, the cadences and the rhythm of the track fit Dusty perfectly. Or she must have been listening and absorbing the track in her own mind, so that when she finally came to sing, overdubbing the songs in New York, they were perfect.
Engineer on the album, Ed Collis.
Next step to make it real big was to take that, what I call the lump of soul, went up to New York, and they turned it into a diamond. Because when that record came back, that mix that we heard, that pressing, it was just an awestruck moment. It was hats off to what they did to what was done in Memphis, and the arrangements, and it was just tasty as could be.
The total lack of success of the Dusty in Memphis album was really quite staggering, especially after the album had been so nicely teed up by Son of a Preacher Man. Released early in 1969, the album reached number 99 in America, and it missed the UK charts altogether. In fact, to make it worse, it was her first album ever to suffer that fate. Here's Vicky Wickham.
When she'd made the album, she was so proud of it. I mean, she played me down the phone, Son of a Preacher Man, about 20 times, and was just jumping up and down with, what do you think, isn't it great? You know, it's the greatest song you've ever heard, strange title, etc., but I really think it's great. I really think we've got a shot with this. And she thought this would, you know, break it for her in a very different way and get her away from pop music, and she would, you know, be able to expand and do what she wanted to do. It was critically acclaimed, but sales-wise were dismal. It didn't get a great deal of airplay, and it just didn't catch people's imagination. I don't know whether it was that they were used to Dusty doing pop and so couldn't accept it, which is probably it. But you know, there wasn't a buzz on it. There wasn't anything. It was just so disappointing. If you think about it, and if you think what else was around at the time, this stood out in a way like a sore thumb. It wasn't right. I mean, had that been now, you know, with Rod Stewart doing all these classics, I mean, it would have gone to number one the first week. The lack of success was a huge knockback for her. She really felt violated. She felt that, you know, people didn't understand her, that, you know, what she loved, and she felt that her instincts for once were wrong, that perhaps she shouldn't have done it and she should have stuck to the same old formula. Although, having said that, Dusty was never somebody that wanted to go back. She always wanted to break new ground and go forward.
Within a few weeks, Dusty was recording again. She was hosting her TV series Decidedly Dusty, and before the end of '69, she was working with some new US production collaborators in Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff. But the legacy of Dusty in Memphis, like a number of other 60s albums, has been enhanced in the last decade by fans who were probably too young to remember its release, and that's been heartwarming for some of those who do.
It was the only album in her entire career I've heard her talk about every track with pride.
I think, you know, when we were doing the tracks on her, I probably had made up in my mind that if this girl don't do this better, she's going nowhere. But, you know, she went to New York, like I said, and put a nail in it.
Rolling Stones top, 50, everybody's top 50, and you talk to a lot of people, admittedly, no, not just of my age, but people who know her from Son of a Preacher Man, Pulp Fiction, or who know her from Pet Shop Boys, all say Dusty in Memphis is the one to have in your collection. And when it was repackaged on Universal Mercury, I think it sold extremely well.
You must be delighted at the way that this album has become, I'm not going to use the word cult, because I think that's kind of, not a particularly nice word to use, but it has gone on to be newly appreciated, hasn't it? Certainly over the last kind of 10 or 20 years.
Well, it's been one of the joys of my life. The fact that this record has had such a fantastic afterlife when we made it in '68, and it's still a living, breathing presence, and been reissued so many times. Every guy that comes to this house needs to have the Dusty record.
And a final story from the lady whose name was on the record. After Son of a Preacher Man was used in Pulp Fiction, Dusty Springfield was awarded a platinum disc for sales of the soundtrack.
I loved it. I got my first platinum disc from that. I mean, it was funny, all these years I never got a platinum disc. And it showed up at the door. I didn't know it was coming. Vicky had mentioned it, my manager had mentioned it, and to tell you the truth, I forgot about it because I kind of went, oh yeah. I just didn't believe it, actually. I think we all got it for the album. It showed up at the door and I thought it was something I'd ordered from a catalogue, because I'm always ordering things from catalogues. And, they're always gadgets and things, and they always land up under the stairs because I can't use them. Or I can't find anyone to do it for me because I'm useless. And there it was, this rather thin thing, and I thought, what on earth did I order? Didn't have a label on it, so I didn't say like Kaleidoscope or Laura Ashley or something. And it was, I took it out, it was this enormous, it was really heavy, this enormous poster of Pulp Fiction. It's very flashy platinum disc on the bottom. And it's just, I was really touched.
Dusty in Memphis was written and produced by me, Paul Sexton. It was a colour TV production for BBC Radio 2.